Well, Industry 4.0 was se você conseguir aumentar a sonorização. Not in the sense of innovation, but in the sense of Society 5.0. So it will have an impact on the history if you consider the Stone Age, millions of years ago, then the appearance of agriculture, but obviously everything is complemented by culture. And then the 19th and 20th century, where we had the transformations driven by capitalism. Thank you. Hi, thank you. It's nice to see you here. Anyway, there was that time, and then finally, in the 60s and the 70s, we had the industrialization, industrial automation. That was in the second half of last century in terms of capitalism. And then Fortaleza, and he lives in Stockholm, in Sweden. Over to you, Icarus, so that you can talk a little bit about the industry and the relationship between innovation and Society 5.0. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Should I stand? Thank you all for joining us, and thanks for everyone joining us online. It's great to be back here in person, to have this contact with you. Technology is a great thing. It allows us to communicate better and virtually, but there's nothing like meeting people again. I'm going to talk about essential patents as a pillar of 5.0 society. 5G was one of the pillars of Society 5.0 because Society 5.0 says that technology should bring some kind of social well-being, in summary. So, I'd like to start with this picture. I would imagine that anyone here who's over 35 or 40, you will know what this is. There was a nickname for this in Fortaleza. It was called the Big Brick. If you search for Big Brick or tijolão in Portuguese online, this is what you will come up with. So technology allowed communication to move from our houses to our pocket. And the main service it provides is voice service. Kind of noisy, but suddenly we could communicate remotely. As you can see, the battery is quite large, it's quite heavy, and it didn't last very long. Another interesting aspect, Álvaro mentioned the spaceship taking people to a different planet. So the spaceship is small, right? Only a few people fit in there. And what I remember about this phone was an uncle of mine who was rich. It was rare for somebody to have this mobile phone. It was a sign of status if you had one of these. And it wasn't that affordable. Anyway, time went by, these devices became smaller. I think everyone here probably started with a smaller device. Voice quality improved, batteries became smaller. We started using SMS, and still people use that service as a very popular service. And later, 3G happened. And the next step was 4G. Apps. And they're all part of our life now, part of society. And if you compare 1G all the way through to 4G, you see much more accessibility. 3 years ago, I saw somebody on a horse in Cuba with a smartphone. So that shows that accessibility to technology has increased. Next step is 5G. One of the pillars of Society 5.0, because communications and mobile internet were a pillar. And when we talk about 5G, And this is a timely moment to talk about 5G, because 5G is coming to Brazil. Sometimes we split it into advanced societies, industrial transformation, and new experiences such as AR, VR. Industrial transformation is good, and when we started seeing 5G, mobile telecommunications played a role that electricity played in the Industrial Revolution. So you can increase productivity through mobile technology, and advanced societies. That's where the connection with Society 5. I won't give you all the examples, but we heard about connected vehicles this morning, reaction time to accidents, remote health services, electronic medical records. And I know it sounds like science fiction. People ask me, do you really believe that can happen one day? And then I remember the big break. And I think about today's phones and all the innovation that comes in between. It's hard to say how long things will take, but the history is here to show that we did play that role. It was a revolution, and we can continue to revolutionize things. But that didn't happen out of the blue. In order to move from the big break to transformation in society, there has to be a development. And this is fostered by patent licenses and essential patents. And that's the connection with those of us who work in intellectual property. We had invested at least 20 billion reais, sorry, in R&D. So about 30 years to get to where we are now. So my first message to you is R&D is partly fostered by essential patent licensing. Second thing I want to talk about is interoperability. And I'll start with a simple story. When I came to São Paulo, I bought a smartphone, an iPhone, and I used that iPhone in Sweden, in Stockholm, where I live. And then I come back to Brazil, I turn it on, and it works. It's almost like magic. You know, Stafford Massey was saying that technology has the most impact when it disappears. I like to say that it's when you take it for granted. I was thinking about interoperability during his presentation. We have standardized systems, and smartphones need to communicate with other devices on the network. So, for that to be possible, there has to be a common language between those two things. And that's what communication systems do, 5G. And there's a very interesting thing about communication systems, which is we who are, in a way, competitor, we are Ericsson. We compete with other links in the chain, but we sat down at this forum and we decided to agree with this technology. We have to agree that signals will be sent through this, that there will be predictive behavior. And that is what allows phones to be used in Brazil, California, and Sweden. Same phone. I had the privilege, I think it's a privilege, to be a part of that history. I'm very proud of that, and the relationship between that and IP is that if I have to sit down with my technology to come to a consensus, I have to be protected, right? And the way that can happen is through intellectual property, because I'm developing technology based on my concepts, which is the result of the work done at my research centers, and I've invested in them. So I need to protect myself. Because here you're agreeing with details about communication systems, so you need to make sure that the delegates, and I was a delegate, that they're protected. You say, look, this is what we're thinking, we talk, we share, we listen, and based on technical methodologies, we try to come to the best solution. And this is where IP comes into it, and this concept of interoperability. I don't know any other industry where there's the same need for competitors to sit down and discuss a common solution. This is a collaborative environment. There are many colleagues from other businesses where we can discuss openly. And that's the second message. IP is key to 5G because there's a need for interoperability among different devices. Now, I'd like to bring those two elements together by talking about FRAND. Fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. And it's basically, you invest in R&D, you describe your techniques,
and in a way, ideas can be proposed, and these technologies are patented, and they become what we call an essential patent, which we call a firm commitment that I signed as an industry, that these patents are part of the system, they're essential, and they need to be accessible or made available for whoever wants to build the system. I say this is democratic because you can allow another company that wishes to go into the new system and manufacture, they can resort to this. And if I have access to high-quality, high-performance technology, there has to be a counterpart that says that you need to compensate the developers of this technology. And this is a cycle, as I said, about the licensing system. This is 3G and 4G licensing that make 5G possible. So this is a successful system, and there are many ecosystems today that act upon this need. Now, we are several companies, and we can say that there's distribution, and there's also a difference. And here I conclude by talking about the third point: adequate compensation for technology holders and access to technology by implementers creating a well-balanced ecosystem. I'm going to close just giving you an example. You heard the opening lecture, and there was an event in 2007, which was the launch of the smartphone. And before that, he showed a mobile device by Nokia, which was not a smartphone. And there is the fact that although we had smartphones, there's the technology of that little square. That was developed during those 30 years, so that was something that came out of nothing. And it was thanks to your contribution that the companies that developed technology or had developed technology until then could benefit by the success of that earthquake that was a smartphone. So you're contributing, you're making a cake and you're contributing to some ingredients like the yeast. And lastly, what does this have to do with Brazil, since we are Brazilians? In order to be a reference in innovation in a 5.0 society, Brazil needs to assure adequate compensation for innovative technology holders. We cannot have something that blocks information.
Access to technology is very important, true friend. Competitive and collaborative. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Icaro, for the brilliant presentation and the importance of investing in R&D and the correlation with the use of these technologies, because these are means for Society 5.0 can provide services and well-being anytime, anywhere to anyone. So it's not just about access, but also the possibility that not only your rich uncle has access to technology, but all of Society 5.0. I think that is the main concept that Japan proposes, as Professor Alvaro said, the concept of Society 5.0. So now, first of all, I'd like to thank you for both of your talks and to open the floor for questions. And we'll also be taking questions online. We already have a question from the audience. Please state your name and where you're from. Good morning. Congratulations, Professor Álvaro and Icaro. I'm a lawyer here in São Paulo. I have a question to both of you. Icaro, what is your creative process? And Professor Álvaro, how can we foster innovation? Thank you. Thank you. Let me see if I got your question right. How to foster technological creation? Is that what you asked? The creative process as a whole. Oh, the creative process in the human brain. All right, okay, yes. Well, I asked that because there's a huge difference between fostering technology development and fostering creativity. Technological development happens in very few academic labs and many businesses. Well, not many businesses, but a few businesses that do a lot. The best way to make it happen is through capital and the best minds. Turing, for instance, the Turing Medal has been awarded to professionals who are currently members of the board at Google, Jeffrey Hein, for instance. All these guys who have developed many technologies. Creativity is different because if we look at the brain, the creative process uses the same areas of the brain as those that rescue autobiographical memory. So creativity comes from the transformation of small memory fragments and restructuring them into narratives. So this reorganization of creativity follows the same rationale we follow to bring back episode memory. So we put things into a broader context, then there's a subcontext, and then remember more specific things. It's very hard to bring something back that is buried deeply. It usually happens sideways. So converting long-term memory into new processes and creativity is called mental time travel. And I have lots of papers on that. As you get older, you have papers on everything. And one of the assumptions of mental time travel is that the phenomenon influx, in other words, the experience you get as stimuli come to our attention and our awareness block our ability to move away from the now. So one of the main things that lead to creativity is changing your focus to that which is outside in the world to your own mind. So it's the DNA of imagination coming into play. It's a reversal. So you stop experiencing what you're living in real time and you start building things in your own mind using memory, especially. Divergent thinking is the ability of not making stronger associations when you have a stimulus. So for instance, if I say apple, it's very likely that someone will say red because it's a very strong association. Because the basis of creative thinking, in addition to this narrative thinking that I mentioned, is also the change in the chains where you inhibit more obvious processes. So curiously, creativity has a lot to do with inhibition in phenomenological terms and associations. Great. Those watching us online have asked us if we can turn up the volume. So I'll turn it over to Icaro now, and then we'll have more questions. Great. I can talk about my own personal experience. I'm more creatively prolific when I'm explaining something to someone, and then I hear a comment or a question and we build from there. I unfortunately don't know the theory as well as Professor Alvaro. In in fact, we could talk about that. I'm very curious about how that can help, but that's my own personal experience. I believe that considering systems development, systems like 5G, for instance, it's very important that the talk among these companies, where we, each one of us have developed our own concepts and methods, but when we share those ideas with others, then you get to hear other feedback, other thoughts from other groups that have different problems, to which that might be a solution. And then we can come up with other solutions, and that collaborative industrial process is also part of the success, which is that revolution from the big brick all the way to today, and the contrast.
When you're confronted, you cannot give up when someone says your idea doesn't work because of X. I think that this actually encourages me in my creative process, because I'm challenged to find new solutions, or to try and argue why I do not agree with this other aspect. I think that this helps me a lot. Well, I work with consultancy and innovation, and we see that the first thing that we have to have is to be pragmatic in developing innovative processes so that investment can materialize in new technologies and so on. But what is cool is to hear that there is another side which is just as important as the pragmatic side of processes, which is the association of new ideas, or perhaps following information that are sort of loose in the brain of someone or several people. You can also develop that with a group of people in a company in order to improve the performance of given solutions, and also to hear those that would like to have a kind of technology, some kind of use that there is that exists today. And this is a boost for people who develop new technologies. So before opening to the audience, I'd like to start with a question from the virtual panel, and I think that the question should be oriented to Iker, but Professor Alvaro can also answer. What is necessary for a patent to be considered essential? It needs to be essential. I mean, it's just a joke, but actually it needs to be essential, and in order to be that, it needs to be based on these specs, as we call them. There has to be a kind of a check. It has to be proven that the patents are in a given technology, what is specified and essential to a system. So we say that a patent is essential when it is present where it needs to be. For you to say that a device is 5G, for instance, there are kinds of mobility in 5G, and that all devices have to have that. Otherwise, you cannot move about. So if you look at the specs and all of the criteria are met, you can say it is an essential patent. There are also some bureaucratic issues, but I think that this is enough for us here. Interoperability is also what assures what you were explaining. I'd like to complement this answer. I think that there are two kinds of essence, and it is very interesting to talk about that. A patent can be essential in terms that whatever is created is essential. So many people or many companies have created things that are essential. They are patents. But there is another different sense, which is essential as being that which leads to the development of other things, several things. The essence as being the first element, and then it doesn't look as essential at all, but actually it lies at the base of several other things that are essential. So I think that there are at least two senses to essential patent, which have to do a lot more, or that have a lot more in common with the meaning of essential than categories of patents that we've never heard about, because they're actually essential? Yeah, your definition is more philosophical, and I will take it with me. Well, when I don't know about the subject matter, I turn to philosophy. We have one more question from the audience. So we have a first question here. We have 7 minutes before we conclude this panel. We're the first panel, so we have to be exemplary punctual. Thank you very much. Congratulations to the 2 lecturers and Patricia for being the moderator. A question to Professor Alvaro about privacy, the right to privacy as described today and as it is understood by academia and the legal world dates back to 1890 with the instant photography or snapshots. People started to be photographed and published in newspapers and the like, and people were bothered by their hyper exposition of their images, and so the right to privacy started to be discussed then. But today we have hyper connectivity, hyper exposure of images. So my question in neuroscience is, has neuroscience detected some kind of change in the expectation of privacy of human beings? I imagine there's a different expectation because we trigger this hyper exposure. Well, this is a genius question, and the answer is yes and no. Yes, in terms of behavior, we already see a very strong generational change, and the issues of privacy have an impact on the young in a very different way if compared to older people. And several practices that we think that are completely irrational, like sexting, for instance, that leads to regret, is very much widespread amongst the young. And this brings up a change in the perception of what is private and what is public. Transgression that bothers is much more the malicious use than otherwise. But the mapping of these changes from this brain point of view is not so observable, because a clear change in society today is that of behaviors becoming algorithmic. There's a way of dealing with things that are different. We see differences in changes in children of 1 or 2 years old that are born with technology. So mirror neurons and social cognition and projections of subjectivity are matters which have not been fully mapped out. And I think this is a genius question, because I think this is the big issue of neurosciences in its interface with law over the next few years or decades. Now, there's a question from the audience. Can you say your name? I am Andre. First, I'd like to thank the presenters for their speeches, which were so interesting. And the question is addressed to Icaro. You had ended your presentation saying how Brazil could remain strategic and at the same time have economic return in innovation development. Is there something concrete to help us reach this goal? Because this would be inherent to the patent system naturally, I think, but I think that essential patents require an additional step. So is there something in the international market from a different country, some regulation or something that could help us out, or is this just defending patents and the market will organize itself regardless? I think that the first step is to talk about this and understand how things work. So I'll go back to the issue of the photograph, the snapshot. If you don't work in communications, you think there was a revolution where everything that was left behind no longer exists, and that smartphones has have replaced everything that existed till then. This is not true. The truth is that the technology in smartphones for communication are the technologies of what there was there before. It's a bit different from Kodak and films, as Stafford showed it. So I think that the first step, especially here in Brazil, and this is what I try to work with, is to talk about this, to explain how things work for people working in telecommunications, a collaborative ecosystem, and from then on to talk about examples of other courts in other countries, how they deal with essential patents in order to ensure this kind of protection to companies that hold title over technologies. So let us move to online questions. There were praise to the presentations made. And Alvaro, I'd like to ask you, you're making science and innovation more popular with your exposure in the media. So how can you explain science, which is so complex, to the audiences at large? Well, Secret speaks several times. I'm going to tell you a secret. After all, we are before an audience. Whenever I want to learn something new, I schedule a course, because then I have to learn it myself very profoundly. There's a philosopher I like a lot, is Daniel Dennett, a philosopher of the mind who's somewhat complex. The GPT-3, and there's this issue of algorithms emulating human speech, and this emulates Daniel Dennett, and Daniel Dennett experts could not identify algorithms in people, but algorithms are very bad for human speech. And if this happens, it's because we do not understand Daniel Dennett very well. And I have to avoid the Daniel Dennett effect. We have to tell things in such a way that everybody can understand. This does not reduce the scope of what you say. It does the opposite. Of course, you have to work with a mystery in the middle, but every speech has to end clearly. You have to be honest, and you have to say what you can explain to everybody. So stimulation is key as opposed to inhibition. I would like to say that Society 5.0 achieves a degree of convergence between the virtual space, which is cyberspace, and the real one, which is the physical space. The future is now. What we were envisaging as science fiction on films is already here to stay, and it is a transition of which we have gone beyond the point of no return. Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you all.